Hi Year 9. In today's lesson we're going to look at a few things to do with the Gallipoli campaign. We're going to look back on the aims of the campaign, we're going to look at the initial landing, and we're going to look at the conditions that Anzac troops found themselves facing as the campaign bogged itself down. So to understand why there was a Gallipoli campaign, we have to stop and really look at what was happening in Europe at the time. So this is the Western Front, alright? So this is the theatre of war in Europe, okay? What's really happening in the Western Front is that the Germans have been halted, okay? They've been stopped, their advance into France has been stopped, and trench lines have formed, okay, into what we'd call a stalemate, where neither side has an advantage. What this leaves for the Entente forces, for the British, the French, and the Russians, is really not much opportunity to gain ground here. So the Gallipoli campaign is a sort of out-of-the-box theory that if they can break through the Dardanelles, which is a strait we're going to look at in a minute, attack Constantinople here, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, they'll be able to supply the Russians. They might bring Greece into the war on the side of the Allies, and they might get rid of the Ottoman Empire, leaving Germany and Austria fighting a war on two fronts. Front number one, front number two. Alright, so this map has enough squiggles on it. Let's move on. So if the British Navy want to supply the Russians to help them fight the Germans and the Austrians, they can do that, okay, but they can only do that when the sea isn't frozen over. So that's only an option in the summer sort of months. In winter, that sea freezes over, so the British would really love to be able to go through here and supply the Russians to help them fight the war on the Eastern Front. Okay, not much is happening on the Western Front at the moment. It's a stalemate. Okay, so to do that, they're going to need to get rid of the Ottomans. So this map is just a zoomed in version of what we were just looking at. But as we're getting closer, we can see the Gallipoli Peninsula. I might just circle it. Alright, so peninsula just being that sort of thin bit of land that sticks out into the sea. That's where we're going to zoom into in the next map and have a look. And you can see with the red arrows, it's where the British would like to be able to move their ships through. But obviously, this is the Ottoman Empire's territory, and they have a lot of defences in this area. If you want to pause on this slide, you can read these points. So the person we have to thank for the Gallipoli campaign is Winston Churchill, which is a name that's probably familiar to most of us. He's the Prime Minister for part of the time during World War II for Britain. But at this time, he's the Lord of the Admiralty, the First Lord of the Admiralty, which is a position that puts him in command of a lot of strategy. So his plan, and there's this prevailing belief that the Ottoman Empire is weak. It's nicknamed the sick man of Europe. He thinks that if he can knock Turkey out of the war, the Ottoman Empire is mostly what we'd call modern Turkey today. If he can knock them out of the war, it'll open up supply lines to the Russians and help them push on the Eastern Front to break that stalemate on the Western Front. The initial attack fails. The initial attack is a naval plan. If we go to the next map, alright, the naval campaign is to just push through here, alright, and hopefully not have to land too many troops. But what they find is that the gun placements along the coast, which are represented here by little cannons, it's enough of a defense to stop them. And there's also a lot of sea mines, okay, and they lose a number of ships, slows down the advance, and they realize they're going to have to land a large number of troops to fully take the peninsula before they can move ships through. And if you remember, the goal in the end is to take the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, which is a little further up the Dardanelles. So just to stop and look at the geography, the Dardanelles is the strait, alright, the thin body of water. Gallipoli Peninsula is this whole thin bit of land, and Anzac Cove is just this small one beach here. That's where the Australians land. The British and French are landing down here, and the British again later try landing again up here in Suvla Bay. So now we understand a bit of the geography. This sort of recruitment poster you might have seen before, which is an example of propaganda, might make a bit more sense to you. So a call from the Dardanelles. So from that body of water, that strait that we just looked at, it's a call from the Dardanelles, enlist now. Cooey, won't you come? So you can tell he's an Australian soldier. He's got his slouch hat. He's wearing, he looks like he might be in the light horse. He looks just like a soldier who might have freshly arrived at Anzac Cove, and he's calling for recruits from home to come join and help with the effort. So this is a useful image because it shows us the shape of the land, like the topography. So if we look at Anzac Cove, you can see some very steep ridges and hill lines. You can see Cape Helles is another difficult landing spot. The Cape is just the tip of the peninsula. Suvla Bay is a bit easier, and they try again there later in 1915. But you can imagine that if the Ottomans, the Turkish, if they are commanding all the hilltops, okay, and looking down on the troops who are landing, then it's a really defensible position. It's very difficult for the Entente forces to achieve their aims. Okay, so they're planning on essentially landing, and they think the Ottomans are weak. They think they can just push right through all the way to Constantinople, their target off in the distance there. On this slide, there's a link to a YouTube video that it's a sort of collection of drone shots to show you the sort of shape of the land. So you can pause that, you can pause the recording now and have a look at that video if you like. Okay, we've got an old photograph here. So you can see soon after the landing, they start setting up pontoons and they start making a home for themselves. But what we can see, and something we saw already in the topographical map, is the ridge lines. It's pretty difficult terrain. You can see it's quite rocky with a lot of shrubs. We've got from 1919, so someone who survived the campaign, have gone back and they've done a sketch. So you can see again the same sort of feature of the land. The main feature is these big hills, big slopes, not easy terrain to navigate. So Charles Bean, it's a name that might become familiar over the next week or so. He's the Australian war correspondent, and he describes the land as the growth was stubborn and in steep, gravelly waterways with which the hillside was scored. It was as much as a strong man could do to fight his way through it, to say nothing of carrying his heavy kit and rifle. So that kit is your food, your water, your ammunition, any bombs or grenades you might be carrying, a small shovel that you'd be carrying, a heavy coat, a blanket perhaps. There's a lot of kit that they're actually carrying with them, and it's because they intend to just push on through. They need to be carrying everything they need for to stay independent for a couple of days. So they're carrying a lot of equipment with them, as well as their rifle, and as well as navigating these these steep, gravelly hills and mountains. We're going to look at two different quotes that offer us two different perspectives. So in history, a perspective is a point of view. The first one is from the actual commander of the overall campaign. So his name's Ian Hamilton, and he's actually watching the landing at Anzac Cove from his ship. The ship he's on is called the Queen Elizabeth, and he says, "The landing was in full swing. Shrapnel was bursting over the water, the patter of musketry, the machine guns spluttered. They are not charging up to this Sari Bair range for money or compulsion. They fight for love. All the way from the Southern Cross for love of the old country and of liberty." Okay, I'll read the next quote. I want you guys just to think how these contrast, how they're different. So this one's from a different sort of perspective. It's from a soldier. Okay, and he writes his diary. It goes on, and you're going to use this in the activity sheet. But I'll just read the first day for you. So he's written this the day after the initial landing. Landed last night. There are plenty of wounded. I have carried some dead ones past too. The shrapnel from the Turks is flying over as I write. The Turks bombarded us all day. We lost a few men. One of our sergeants got shot through the brain. Shrapnel has done a lot of damage to us. There are a hell of a lot killed and wounded. E. Walters and 12 more sergeants. That's April 26, 1915. One of the interesting things that you can go see down at the Australian War Memorial if you're down in Canberra. Oh, there we go. This one's a little quote. It was a great fight while we were getting out of the boats, and a good many got shot. But a bayonet charge soon shifted the Turks, so moved the Turks off the sort of highland they were holding, and things got pretty lively. Towards 12 noon, they were knocking us over pretty often, and I stopped a bullet in my pocketbook after I'd been shot through the arm. So a bullet's gone through his arm. It's obviously lost a lot of force and the impact it had, and it's actually been stopped by his pocketbook. And you can see this item down in the War Memorial Museum. You can see the bullet impact left there. So he's lucky to be alive, but he still got shot. So a couple more photos. Again, you can see the big hilly terrain. It's quite cramped down on the beach. Okay, it's not a very comfortable place to be stuck for 8 months. If you have a look here, again, you can see it's very cramped. These are the wounded. Okay, and here's another one from the hill looking down back on Anzac Cove. And you can see every time you leave Anzac Cove, you're going to have to climb up the hill. So if you're wounded fighting, you're going to have to be stretchered back down the sort of treacherous hills, the gravelly, and put on a boat. And then there are hospital ships out in the bay away from the Turkish gunfire, and you might be evacuated to one of the Greek islands. Here we've got an interesting sort of painting. Okay, digging in. So digging in is when you get out your entrenching tool. All right, they'd all carry. This guy's actually got a full pickaxe with him. But the entrenching tool is something that most soldiers would be carrying with them in case they need to entrench, so to dig a trench. What happens is they hold some land, they grab some land, and to make it defensible, to make it an area you can actually hold and defend, you've got to start digging a trench. So that's what these soldiers are doing. Often they try and hold it during the day, and then once the sort of sun set and it got a bit darker and the Turkish people couldn't shoot at you, you'd have a bit of cover to start getting up and digging. But they're doing it lying down under fire. An interesting, we always, as Australians, we think of Gallipoli as important for our nation, but it's also really important for the Turkish. So Mustafa Kemal, I'll just read this section for you, but he's a really important figure. On the heights above the beach, the Anzacs came face to face with Turkish reinforcements. When his men ran out of ammunition and started to fall back, Kemal, the Turks' ranking commander on the beachhead, told his men to fix their bayonets and lie down. So his men have run out of ammunition, and he's holding the high ground. But if he sort of packs up and leaves, he'll surrender it to the Anzacs, the enemies. From his perspective, the Anzacs and the British and the French and everyone else who's landed at Gallipoli, they're invading the Ottoman Empire. They're the enemy. So he wants to hold this high ground. And he says, I don't order you to attack, I order you to die, he told his men. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders can take our place. So he needs them to hold out for reinforcements, even though they don't have any ammunition. They have no bullets left. But he's told them to just fix bayonets and hope that they can intimidate or scare off the Anzacs. And it actually works. They lie down, and when the Anzacs see them, they assume that they're lying down ready to shoot at them. And they actually sort of hold off. And it delays them enough that Turkish reinforcements arrive. So he's going to become an important figure. He actually becomes the first president of the Turkish Republic after the Ottoman Empire falls apart. So it's a very rough start. In the evening, Major General William Bridges, commander of the 1st Australian Division, and Lieutenant General Sir William Birdwood, commander of the Anzac, so the commander of all Anzac forces. They both advised Sir Ian Hamilton, who we heard the quote from before, the commander-in-chief, to withdraw the Allies from Gallipoli. After the first day, they decide this isn't worth it. Hamilton decided against their recommendation, and he orders troops to begin digging trenches. The Anzacs held on for their crucial first night. Of the 16,000 men who landed during the first day, more than 2,000 have been killed or injured by the next morning. So after listening to those accounts, we're going to return back to this map that we started with earlier. And I want to point out the first thing on my cursor is that this is what they planned to achieve. This is how much land they hoped they were to take on the first day. And the thick purple line here, I've just gone over in yellow, is what they actually managed to take. So they've completely underestimated what they were capable of and what the Turkish were capable of in defending. And if you stop and pause, you can take a bit more time to look at this map. But by the end of the campaign, they've barely made any ground, and it is, like every capacity, it's a disaster. It's a failure. So there's not really anything to recover from here. Why did the campaign fail? Initially, it's a naval campaign, and that's a complete failure because of the Turkish sea mines and the sort of artillery that they have along the coast. The steep and difficult terrain that we saw in a lot of the images. There's also a lot of poor planning and indecisiveness. So a lot of the maps they have aren't the best. They aren't appropriate for the area. People are dropped off in places they didn't expect. There's a lot of vague planning. It's a real thrown together sort of campaign. And then the big thing is they really do underestimate the Turkish ability to defend the position, and their resolve. So their resolve is, if they're defending their homeland, they're resolved, okay, to not give up. So those four are sort of four big dot points you can think about when you want to think, why did the campaign fail? So just looking at a few more pictures here. This is a picture taken in a captured Turkish trench. These are Australian soldiers. The sort of fighting that happens in the trenches, if we have a look at what this gentleman's holding, that's the bayonet that you'd attach to the end of your rifle. And when you jump in a trench, your long rifle isn't very practical, so you're going to swap to a bayonet like that. You might have it on the end of your rifle to use kind of like a spear, or you might just stab people with the bayonet in your hand. We just got an old postcard. You can pause and read that one if you like. This is interesting. When we think of Gallipoli, we don't often think of snow, but in the winter, in November, okay, they don't evacuate till January, but in November it actually is quite cold, and they suffer through the heat and they suffer through the cold at Gallipoli. Someone might have heard of is Simpson and his donkey. Interesting story. He was a British soldier, or a British citizen, who then, in order to try and get home to England, he enlisted in the Australian Army. He was living in Australia at the time, and he ends up in Gallipoli, unfortunately for him. But he does a lot of work using a couple of donkeys to. He's in the ambulance service, so he's rescuing people who have been injured and bringing them back down to the hospital ships. He actually dies though at Gallipoli, but his sort of actions create a bit of a legend, a bit of a story around him. So I've mentioned the hospital ships. They're manned, or they're womened, all right, by nurses. And at Lemnos, okay, one of the Greek islands, that's where a lot of the severe casualties are evacuated to, because there's no room on the beach to set up a field hospital or properly treat people. Speaking of not much room, this is what sort of a cookhouse might look like. It's not a full kitchen. They don't have very good, don't have much access to fresh food. I'm going to look at the conditions a bit later. But you can see it's very cramped for 8 months. Down at the field hospital, we've got a quote from an orderly, someone who worked there, and they say that men had lost arms and legs. Brains oozed out of shattered skulls. and lungs protruded from riven chests. Many had lost their faces and were, I should think, unrecognisable to their friends. One poor chap had lost his nose and most of his face, and we were obliged to take off an arm, the other hand, and extract 2 bullets, like shark's teeth, from his thigh, besides minor operations. It was really a precious hour or more wasted, for I saw him the next morning being carried to the mortuary. The mortuary is where they keep all the dead or the deceased soldiers. So in total, 26,100 Australian casualties at Gallipoli. This includes 8,141 who were killed in action, died of wounds, or succumbed to disease. Okay, this becomes a bit of a factor in those cramped conditions in sort of the hot and in the cold. People are getting sick at Gallipoli. So looking at the conditions, without the modern conveniences of refrigeration, supply ships coming from Greece or Egypt couldn't bring nutritious fresh meat or vegetables or fruit. So this is a lot of what they're eating. Corned beef, so beef in a tin, and these hard biscuits, okay? Designed for longevity, not for nutrition or pleasantness. So the Anzac diet's mainly tinned bully beef for protein, hard dry biscuits, like a sort of solid carb, tinned jam, tea leaf, or coca for hot drinks. The biscuits were so hard they often had to be soaked in water. They might break them down, try and make a porridge sometimes, and then grated into mush to make them edible. Many men broke a tooth on hardtack. In the early days, there were no army dentists. You can see the guy there ready to chow down on his bully beef. So just a couple of summaries for what the conditions are like. So we've talked about disease specifically. It's a lot of dysentery, so a stomach bug, malaria, typhoid, which is spread by lice, a lot of unburied bodies. In between the trench lines are a lot of people who've been killed in the fighting, and it's impossible to get them out unless they have a truce. So once they declare a truce, it doesn't happen too many times at Gallipoli, but people are able to come out of the trenches and retrieve the bodies of their comrades. Because of the bodies, we get lots of flies. And you're going to read a source in the activity sheet that talks about the impact of the flies. You can imagine how annoying that would be and also how disgusting it would be. They've been crawling all over dead bodies. Another thing that'd be awfully frustrating is that there's no water sources on the Gallipoli Peninsula that the Anzacs have access to. So water's brought in by tanker. So it would taste pretty gross. And the ration is half a litre per day. If you're doing exercise, the normal sort of recommendation is 2 litres of water. Not only are they doing exercise, they're fighting with a lot of heavy kit in the heat, and they're getting a ration of half a litre per day. And that is not just drinking water, that's for washing, that's for brushing your teeth, as well as drinking. They're under constant danger from snipers, shelling, machine gun fire. There's a lot of lice on their clothing and their bedding, and then the extreme temperatures. Like we saw the blizzard conditions in November, and we know that when they landed, it's quite hot. Despite that, though, we've got a quote here showing us a bit of the resilience that the Anzacs displayed in the face of these awful conditions. In the early hours of the morning, I heard the officers going along amongst the men saying, "Stick to it, lads, don't go to sleep," and the cheerful reply would come, "No, sir, we won't go to sleep." And my heart swelled with admiration. I thought I was justified in being an Australian. Give me Australians as comrades and I'll go anywhere duty calls. So there you go, there's a quote from 1915. And we've got a quote here from Mustafa Kemal. So he was the Turkish commander who became the first president of the Republic of Turkey. And he says, looking back on the campaign, he says, "Heroes who shed their blood and lost their lives." And he's talking about the Australians and the British and the Senegalese and the French, everyone else who fought there. "You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace." Having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. So we do get this interesting retrospective look, so looking back on the campaign, and for both countries, for modern Turkey, for Australia, for New Zealand as well, this is a formative experience for both these nations. And looking back, there's not too many hard feelings. We were invading them, so can't be too salty about it. And they're proud of the way they defended their territory.